Good morning, everyone. It is the 9th of October, and I'm very pleased to say it is New Article Day. I'm chuckling a little bit about the article because when it went live last night, there is a bit of a typographical issue with the title of the paper, but nonetheless, the rest of the content looks really good. We'll get in touch with the publisher and try and tidy up the title a little bit later. It currently reads as Expanding Heritage Horizons through the Cheltenham Diaspora project. It should be through the Cheltenham Diaspora project. I'm not quite sure how that slipped through the editing process, but the rest of the article looks fine. This paper was put together following sort of the first stage of the Cheltenham Diaspora project, which was looking at both contemporary and historical migration themes in Cheltenham. This paper summarises some of the narratives that we engaged with. So, unsurprisingly, it's a pretty broad church of oral histories that we conducted. So we were speaking with former Polish refugees escaping Siberia, coming to Cheltenham by way of I think India and Angola. We talked about the history of international students who had been spending time at the former college where the University in Cheltenham currently is located. So we talked about the first international students coming over from the West Indies. We talked about one of the most famous students that we have coming from Nigeria. I'm not really talking about those parts of the story in this video because that's not really what this paper is about. What this paper really challenges is the way in which we as heritage practitioners can gather information. One thing that's been of increasing importance to heritage professionals and historians conducting oral histories is the idea of democratizing the heritage and historical process by bringing people into the process and almost allowing our audiences to shape the way in which our research develops. Now, that's all very well and good, and something that should be encouraged. It can be something really positive because communities then begin to take ownership of their own historical narratives, which is great. The problem that we sometimes have is when certain social biases become ingrained. So in recent months, we've been exploring the impact of the Black Lives Matters movement on things like the heritage sector and asking how are museums going to respond to the issues raised over the summer months. One of the major problems that people have been identifying is the issue of representation. Now, when we go out to communities and we start saying, well, okay, we really want to hear your voices, we want to hear your reflections on your communities, that can allow us to plug some of the gaps that have been created by research bias, institutional bias, gender bias and racial bias amongst researchers. But what we can also sometimes identify is the historical legacy of that bias. And this is one of the things that the diaspora paper identifies and explores. One of the things that we wanted to do was engage with Facebook groups, thinking that this would help to democratize the process. But what we found was that many of those audience curated histories were in fact just echoing the biases that have been established in more formal or academic environments for historical discussion and debate. So one of the main issues is a white racial bias in terms of whose history is valued. So we went through a number of local history groups on Facebook relevant to Cheltenham and the surrounds, asking members for their reflections on migration themes. And generally speaking, the feedback was not terribly representative at all. There were reflections on migration. So for instance, white South African migration was something that we heard a huge amount about, which was great. Some really interesting themes coming out there, especially in relation to intangible heritage and food, which is brilliant. I personally love that sort of information from a research perspective. But in terms of just the demographics of these groups, generally speaking, they're not terribly representative. They are by and large white, middle class, and often have a male bias in terms of the most active contributors. And so, really, when we critique academia and museum-based institutions and say, well, okay, they are problematic historically because of a white male middle-class bias. And we start thinking, well, what if we go directly to communities and say, well, can we bring you into the research process? What we sometimes find is that because there is a historical academic white middle-class male bias, that's reflected in terms of how people conceptualize what is of value in terms of historical stories. So it's often white middle-class male voices that are coming forwards. We have a bit of a mix in Cheltenham, but we also have lots of white middle-class female voices who are sort of active coming forward. That's not to say that the Diaspora project was lacking in diversity. It wasn't. But in terms of being able to persuade a wider demographic of voices to come forward and participate, that was something that was much more of a struggle. So I think one of the things that this paper tries to identify and to challenge is the notion that things like social media can be a way of opening up and accessing a wider range of voices. We also have to be incredibly cautious that just because the technology facilitates greater engagement and involvement doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually manifest in that way, and that more often than not, those historical biases created and curated by academia and museum sector, perhaps to a lesser extent, have almost become ingrained in the way in which, certainly in a British context, the way that many communities view and value the concept of heritage or people's histories. It's an interesting challenge to confront, and hopefully this paper does an effective job at addressing where that manifests and some of the ways in which we can contest it as heritage practitioners and historians working in the field. I'll make sure there's a link to the paper. It's an open access, open source article, so it is freely accessible. Read and distribute at your leisure. I'd love to get some feedback on this. This is an ongoing project, so it'd be great to hear some thoughts, reflections, feedback that can feed into the next part of this project. Okay, enjoy the reading, and we'll catch you next time.